Who's going to economic war?
Okay, cool.
Separate. Silent.
We're really silent. We're in the same building. I actually don't know any. I've been wanting to meet them. I don't know any of their competition. I know IR. I love IR. Again, like filled with students at 6 p.m. It's just so good. So IR.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Cutting Edge lecture series that's hosted by the International Development Department of the LSE. This week we're going to be discussing what's at stake in the US-China trade war. To take a little quote from one of our speakers' books, in 1972, when Nixon traveled to China for the first time, he announced that he was traveling there because of his profound conviction that all nations will gain from a reduction of tensions and a better relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. 50 years on from this announcement, the relationship between the two has soured, with the US imposing tariffs and other restrictions on Chinese imports into the US. So in today's session, we'll be exploring what this thawing of relation means for China, for the US, and the rest of the world, particularly developing countries. Before we begin the session, I have to tell you that this is going to be recorded and made available on YouTube and the podcast, so please turn off your phones. And then finally, in the unlikely event of a fire, I have to tell us that we will assemble outside the Saw Sui Hock building and we'll guide you there. So now to introduce our speakers. So first of all, we have Professor Yeling Tan, who is a professor of public policy at Oxford University's Blavatnik School of Government. Her work broadly focuses on the political economy of globalization and development, with a particular focus on China and the broader region. She's the author of many books and articles, including China's Experiments from Local Innovation to National Reform, Asia's Role in Governing Global Health, and her most recent book, Disaggregating China, Inc., State Strategies in the Liberal Economic Order, which looks at the process by which China joined the WTO and looks at how Chinese policymaking was contested and reflected different ideas and interests among Chinese actors about liberalization and joining it. She also looks at the way in which China has reshaped the liberal economic order in terms of its promotion of state capitalism abroad. Second of all, we have Elizabeth O'Brien Ingleson, who is an assistant professor here at the LSE in the International History Department. She's also the author of many articles, as well as her recent book, which was published this year, called Made in China, When US-China Interests Converged to Transform Global Trade. This book focuses on the 1970s in particular, looking at attempts at both US corporations and diplomats, as well as their counterparts in China, to establish and strengthen trade relations between the two. It's very surprising, but in the early days, the trade deficit went in the opposite direction, and real efforts were needed to promote China as a source of labor and as a strong export-oriented economy. So together, their books help us to answer one of the questions that came up last week about the contingency of China's development. Different processes kind of coming together somewhat incidentally or fortuitously. Changes within US financial regulation and US capitalism that resulted in the unbundling of production and the search for cheaper production. Changes in global politics in terms of the changes within the Cold War and attempts by G77 countries to launch new international economic order, and changes both within US and Chinese political economy. Struggles between radicals and more reformist actors in China, as well as more protectionist and liberal currents within the US. So I think today's discussion will kind of apply some of the things we talked about last week to the Chinese case. We're also joined by Robert Wade, who is a professor of political economy and development within our department as the Discussant. It's very difficult to summarize and introduce all of his publications and former employees because he's published so much, but he's perhaps best known for his book, Governing the Market, Economic Theory and the Role of Government in East Asia's Industrialization. So we're both going to let both speakers speak for about 25 to 30 minutes before we hand over to Robert to help us open up the questions and discussion section, and then we'll open up from Q&A from the audience. And again, we have mics on both levels. So without further ado, please welcome our speakers. Do you want to speak from here or there?
I'll speak from up there.
Okay.
Move the legs. All right, and I'll go over. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure in particular to be speaking to such an engaged audience of people who want to engage with ideas and thinking about China, international trade, international development at 4 p.m. on a Friday. So thank you for being here. Thank you for engaging. It's a real pleasure. Thank you also to Laura for organising. I think this is, the conversation with Yeling and Robert Wade will be is one that I've been looking forward to for a while. So there are three and a half things I want to do in the time that I have. I want to begin with a story from the late 19th century in order to illustrate one of the big sort of ideas I'm going to explore. I then want to dive into some of the main ideas of my book that Laura introduced just before. And then this is where it's sort of three and a half. The next thing I want to do is think about how the two ideas I'll have spoken about can help us, as the title for today's talk and conversation outlines, how it can help us make sense of the present day US-China trade war and what the implications might be. So I want to begin by taking us actually to the late 19th century, and I don't want to talk about China or the United States for a minute. Instead, I'm going to situate us here in the UK. So in the late 19th century, there was a perceived threat on the part of the British of what is referred to, or was referred to, and political scientists continue to refer to as the rise of Germany. I have a real problem with that concept of the rise of anything, but that's a different conversation, which I'm happy to talk about. So there was this idea that Germany, through its industrialization, was threatening Britain and seeming to do so through it, partly through its economic power and the implications for geopolitics. One of the major threats and one of the major sort of causes of concern were goods that were being sold and circulated within the United Kingdom that said made in Germany on them. So if you look at the political culture of late 19th century Britain, you will see numerous examples of concerns of things labelled made in Germany, or things made in Germany. So much so that the British Parliament ended up passing legislation saying what we need to do is further identify things that are made in Germany or made anywhere in order to encourage consumers to shift their support away from Germany, our rising threat, towards other countries. And so legislation was passed in the British Parliament in order to put what we now call country of origin labels on goods. Now, there are a number of things that could be said about this moment, but the key thing I want to draw out for us is that if you actually look at the legislation itself, which I did, if you look at what British Parliament passed, they said, how are we going to identify where these goods came from? How are we going to know whether something came from Germany or elsewhere? And they said, what we'll do is if a ship of stuff leaves Germany and arrives here in the UK, we'll know to put made in Germany on the goods because of that destination that it left from. We'll know that the things have been made in Germany because the things left a German port. So the capacity to identify where the country of origin was quite simple in that sense. It was, where did the ship leave? That's how we can know to slap on the label. Now, we know in 2024 that supply chain dynamics, manufacturing, international finance make things very, very different. We know that things labelled made in China, made in the United States, made in Britain, we know that those things are made often along a very long supply chain dynamic. They're not simply made in a singular country. So one of the things that is really important then is to keep in mind this real transition that has happened in the global political economy, the movement from a very sort of a singular form of manufacturing to a internationalized offshore form of manufacturing. And one of the things I do in my book is seek to turn that transition into something that is contingent, to see this transition as something that is not inevitable and not to be taken for granted. So I want to turn to the second sort of key, keeping in mind what I've just talked about, I want to turn to the second key point that I want to make, and that is looking more particularly at how we got to a space in which made in China is on the undersides of so many of the consumer products that we live with today. And one of the key ways to understand this is by looking back at the 1970s moment when China's leaders began in the latter years of the Cultural Revolution to experiment with ways of development. The long history of China under Mao has been one of continuing experimentation with building a socialist state, building a state that can uphold the socialist promise. The history of China under Mao was one of failure of a lot of these experimentations. The Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s, the Cultural Revolution in the mid-1960s. And so by the time you get to the early 1970s, the Cultural Revolution and its real terror that it had wrought across Chinese society continued to inform so much of Chinese politics and society, but it also opened up opportunities for experimentation, opportunities for Chinese political leaders to say we need to have a new direction in development, in political economy, precisely because our previous experimentations have not brought the prosperity that we desire. So one of the things that that a certain group within China began to do in the latter years of the Cultural Revolution was they began to look beyond their borders at changes that were happening within the region, at changes that were happening more broadly, and began to see ways in which they could position China and its economy in concert with the global economy. They began to turn outward. And one of the key ways that this group within China, often referred to as pragmatists, one of the key ways that they sought to do so was to provide a China and a vision of what China might offer the global economy, underpinned by cheap labour. They began to say we have a worker-oriented politics, and we can start to provide a cheap labour for foreign countries. Now, this experimentation, as I say, was happening at the same time as and in conversation with changes that Chinese pragmatists were observing in the global political economy. And one of the key and most important changes that was happening was within the systems and structures of capitalism at this time. It's within this period that American corporations and business people, with permission by American legislators, began to turn towards offshore manufacturing in increasingly high numbers. This is something that was developing. The transition, as I say, from sort of a made in Germany to a made in China in the late 19th century to a made in China today was not inevitable, and in fact, in this 1970s period was still very uncertain. One company, for example, within the United States, JCPenney, very major retailing corporation, began to say, look, we want to start turning to offshore manufacturing, cheap labour will sort of assist us in this process. What they were aiming for in their company archives in this period was still only about 10% of their inventory being made overseas. So that was their aim, to sort of improve their bottom lines, to improve their processes of getting cheap manufacturing, but it was still very small. So the point here is that this shift towards offshore manufacturing was contingent, it was not inevitable, and it was the product of decisions being made not only within corporations in the capitalist world, but assisted by decisions such as pragmatists within China who began to offer an opportunity to assist that and help that process. So the big transformation that I trace in this book is the ways that those two imperatives began to work together. And it's really important to underscore that this is a convergence of interests that not only was not natural or inevitable, but it was the product of a series of decisions that had, I think, really importantly, unintended consequences. And this is the key idea that I think needs to be underscored for the next part of what I want to talk about. So as Chinese pragmatists and as US leaders began to rebuild a trade relationship in this era, and they began to do so via a promise of cheap labour within China, there was no real intention on the part of US policymakers that what they wanted was to offshore labour entirely or to undermine the interests of American workers. That wasn't a deliberate choice. Instead, where the deliberation occurred was a decision to prioritise capital over labour within the United States, to prioritise the interests of capital and to see labour interests within the United States as an irritant, to see them as not as a hindrance to the larger goal, which was to work with China and start to rebuild a relationship. One of the key ways I think we can think about this history and this moment is that it raises really fundamental questions about how a communist nation, the world's largest communist nation, was able to converge with such a significant, the largest player within the capitalist region. And I think one of the key aspects of this is thinking about a Cold War dynamic that, unlike relations between the United States and Soviet Union, which ended with the collapse of one of the two superpowers systems, the Cold War dynamic between the United States and Soviet Union ended in systemic collapse. When we look at the Cold War dynamic and the Cold War animosity between the United States and China, it didn't end in systemic collapse in either nation. The Cold War animosity between the United States and China was one that fizzled out as a consequence of this convergence. It wasn't a systemic collapse. Instead, as this convergence occurred, a new kind of political economy began to emerge, necessitating the changes happening on both sides. Both sides collectively created the form of capitalism, which might be called neoliberal globalization, together. Now, I want to draw out this concept of neoliberal globalization before concluding with the final point I want to make. And that is that this is an idea in which I mentioned the separation of interest between capital and labour within the United States, but it was bound upon an idea in the United States that a certain kind of globalization was going to assist American workers. And it was a kind of globalization that separated consumption from labour. That as we develop on the United States' side, as the United States develops this form of offshore manufacturing, of looking for and encouraging corporations to search for the cheapest possible form of labour, that this would assist American people and American workers by providing cheap consumption, cheap goods for consumption. So there was a separation between the interests of labour and the idea that cheap goods and the benefits of having cheaper products would trickle down and provide the assistance to American people. It's this separation of consumption and labour that hasn't always been or isn't the only model. I don't think I need to tell you all about other development models in this room. One, I think, very flawed but alternative historical point to make is that of Fordism in the early 20th century United States, where consumption and labour were connected, that workers in Ford Motors factory would be paid enough to be able to afford to buy the cars that they make. That's a connection between labour and consumption. I think the neoliberal form of globalisation that was emerging deconnected that in a way that saw cheap consumption as being the key thing to emphasise. So if we think then about how we can think through the US-China trade dynamic today, the so-called conversations about trade wars and tariffs, there are two key ideas I want to pull out. So this is a sort of 3.5 point that I referred to earlier. Now the first point of this is to do with US tariffs themselves, and I want to point out three key problems that arise from this use of tariffs and the politics of underpinning them. Because as I mentioned, we're familiar with the fact that we're living in a world of such deep interconnections and supply chain dynamics, and yet there remains a real political power, not only for Trump but for the Biden administration to be imposing these tariffs. But what we see in consequence is that these tariffs are increasing the logistics of goods entering the United States from China and elsewhere. They're increasing the ways in which goods leaving China must arrive within the United States, often via Mexico, sometimes via Canada. So it's making the logistics more harder, but it's not stopping the trade itself, precisely because of the ways in which international trade and supply chain dynamics operate today. The second thing that it does is that it leads to retaliation. We're seeing China respond to these tariffs both here in Europe with tariffs on whiskey, as well as more targeted tariffs that China has been imposing on raw materials used in chip making and other things. But I think the key third aspect of this focus on tariffs and the politicization of industrial policy more broadly within the United States is that it purports to be assisting American workers. In the Biden administration, there's a significant talk about the middle class within the United States. But it obfuscates the fact that only 8% of the American workforce today works in manufacturing. The American workforce is a predominantly service-based industry. 80 to 95% of the American labour force is in the services industry. So this conversation about revamping manufacturing, about doing so in the face of made in China and the China threat, doesn't address the core purported concern, which is the employment of American workers. That lies in the service sector, it lies in the care economy, in hospitals, in various forms of service. And so the problem with labelling China as an example, and as a key geopolitical example, as a threat to American workers, is that there's supposed solutions, such as revamping industrial policy or imposing tariffs, don't get to the heart of how to help American workers. Now, I want to conclude with a revamping of industrial policy within China as well, because at the same time that you have this real revitalization of manufacturing conversations and attempts within the United States, so too is China revamping and centering its industrial policy for both political and economic reasons. There is a really, I think, important shift that we've seen happening within the Chinese society, and that is a movement towards GDP growth that is so heavily reliant on the clean energy sector, the electric vehicles, solar power, and other things. Clean energy last year was 40% of China's GDP growth. So it was the largest proportion of growth within China came from clean energy. This is really, really significant. It is structural and it is potentially very important. But similarly to the United States, and I should say it's also partly framed in the language of Zhili Gangshang, so self-reliance, a reconfiguration of a much longer Maoist principle of self-reliance. And yet it's not a self-reliant shift. This shift towards green energy is dependent still on relations with the rest of the world. We're seeing that in Western media being labelled China's overcapacity. Its attempts to sell electric vehicles and other things overseas as a sort of supply-side vision of the economy. And so what we're seeing in both countries is an industrial policy that is purporting to be internal and to support their workers, but that are still coming up against the realities of international trade and manufacturing, which is that we are still in an interconnected and global world, but we're living in a politics that remains fairly static. In the United States side of things, it's a politics that is still using the language and ideas and perhaps xenophobia of the late 19th century underpinning the use of Made in Germany and the threats of Made in Germany. We're seeing that same political rhetoric and stasis here in the 21st century. And in China, we're seeing claims to self-reliance and claims to Maoist principles that are butting up against realities of living in a still interconnected world. So I'll leave it there and thank you all for your time and look forward to the conversation and questions afterwards.
So thank you very much to the organizers for this opportunity to be here. Lizzie and I did not coordinate our talking points beforehand, but I'm thrilled because there are so many points of intersection between what I'm going to talk about and the thoughts that she just shared. So I want to begin where Lizzie left off, which is with the current state of US-China relations. And let me begin with a short discussion of this idea of an economic security dilemma. So those of you who study security relations or international relations might have come across this idea of a security dilemma before, right? Where one country's attempts to reinforce defensively their own security is misperceived by another country as an offensive measure, so the other country raises their securitization as well, and that gets misperceived by the first country, and that leads to this escalatory dynamic and a securitization spiral. This idea has been applied in military affairs, and what we're seeing now in terms of US-China relations, the trade tensions, but also the technology tensions, is starting to look increasingly like an economic security dilemma. So where Lizzie left off, I want to bring in the security dimension to the tensions emerging between the US and China. And here, it's really hard to unpack where to begin because each country is reacting to the other. So let's just talk about this action-reaction cycle between the US and China and what it looks like. And then I'll pivot to talking about the implications for developing countries with a focus on Southeast Asia in particular. So the action-reaction cycle from the United States, right? What does that look like? At some point, right, and this has been creeping up over the years, right? The US upgrades its threat assessment with regards to China. This is happening in the military realm. It's also happening in the economic realm. There's a growing sense of disillusionment within US policymaking circles that economic engagement with China has not lived up to certain sets of promises, right? This idea that trade with China ended up costing manufacturing jobs in the heartlands of the US, that trade with China through a multilateral system, as enshrined in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, did not bring about a peaceful integration of this rising power. Rather, it led to more dysfunction, more distortions, and so on. So an upgrading of the threat assessment with China, and then we see the US reaching into its economic security toolbox and unleashing a series of tools and measures, right? So Lizzie talked earlier about the tariffs, right? So the tariffs, and this is a chart by one of my colleagues at the Peterson Institute, right? This gives you a quick review of how the tariff structure changed during the Trump administration, right? As the US raised its tariffs against imports from China, China retaliated and raised its tariffs against imports coming from the United States, right? And there was a bit of a stabilization, right, in 2021 onwards with the Phase 1 agreement. But into the Biden administration, we've seen the Biden administration also reaching into the toolbox of tariff escalation, but in a more targeted fashion, right, on semiconductors, on electric vehicles, and so on. That's just one side of it, right? There has been, you're not meant to be able to see this, read this slide, but this is from the Carnegie Endowment. On the right-hand side here, you see the categorization of a number of different measures that was always existed, right, in terms of the United States government's policy options in what they could enact vis-a-vis other countries that they had economic relations with. So from export controls to investment restrictions, visa restrictions, financial sanctions, and so on and so forth. All of these, since 2017, have been used against China, and in addition, certain measures have been taken to beef up existing regulatory options to use vis-a-vis China in particular. So this is what is happening in the U.S., right? It's an action-reaction cycle, and we can expect China to react, right? And it has its own action-reaction cycle as well. This is why I want to cast this back and forth in the concept of an economic security dilemma. So at some point, right, China upgrades its threat assessment vis-a-vis the United States. There are many instances of how this upgrading occurs, right? One example would be looking at the 2021 14th Five-Year Plan, right? Xi Jinping gives a speech to outline some of the key priorities that's coming up in the 14th Five-Year Plan. In that speech, right, it's notable that in a speech that's about a guiding blueprint for the economy, he mentions the term security 17 times. If you go back 5 years earlier to the 13th Five-Year Plan and compare his speech then, he mentions the term security 5 times, right? And what is also notable about the 14th Five-Year Plan is a call from the Chinese government to coordinate security and development, right? So in Xi Jinping's words, security is a prerequisite for development, and development is a guarantee of security. So this is a deviation from several decades of Chinese national policy that basically had development as the overarching goal, right? Here, security is being elevated to the same plank as development. A couple of years later, you have Xi Jinping doing something quite unusual, which is he calls out the United States, right, by name, and he singles out the US as leading what he calls a strategy of, quote, containment, encirclement, and suppression, right? So all of these measures that I talked about coming from the US, right, it's being interpreted in China in a particular narrative, right? And the narrative that has taken hold, the narrative that has been set out by Xi Jinping is that it's a strategy of containment. And we can see how the action and reaction cycle is leading to escalation on both sides. So this figure here is some of my ongoing research, right? It's looking at phrases called from over roughly 500,000 newspaper articles from China, newspaper articles all related to science and technology. And this line that you see here tracks the relative prevalence of terms related to decoupling. And you can see that there's barely any mention of terms related to decoupling, right, up until the escalation of the technology tensions between the US and China. The phrases related to decoupling keep on increasing, right? And you can map some of the spikes in discourse to actions coming from the US, right? So this is the action-reaction cycle, right? China is responding to the US. What else is happening? We also track, so the solid line here is that same discourse on decoupling that I showed you earlier. The red dashed line that you see here on the screen is a tracking of phrases related to external liberalization, related to international cooperation. So this figure shows you that for most of the years from 2005 onwards, right, Chinese technology policy greatly prioritized external liberalization and international cooperation over concepts like self-reliance, like decoupling, like choke points. This changes with tensions with the United States, and you see discourse related to external liberalization start to dip, starts to fall. They both fall during COVID. And from 2021 onwards, and this is again coinciding with the launch of the 14th Five-Year Plan that emphasizes security alongside development, for the first time you see discourse related to external liberalization fall below discourse related to decoupling, right? And so this shows us how China is also reacting to the measures being exerted by the US in the US's efforts to defend its national security. And we've seen, since 2023, when Xi Jinping called out the US in that unusual way, right, of saying the US is leading this strategy of containment, a series of measures taken by the Chinese party state to strengthen its own sense of self-sufficiency and self-reliance, right? In 2023, there is a restructuring of party state organizations to exert greater party control over science and technology. So there's a committee established in the Central Commission overseeing science and technology. In the third plenum, which is a really important economic meeting that's held every 5 years, this year's third plenum, the party's overall guidance for the economy was, by this time, not surprising. It basically reiterated that what has become a clear imperative now, right, to rectify what the third plenum document calls an over-reliance on key and core technologies controlled by others. And notably, there's an entire section now in the third plenum document that focuses on indigenous innovation and the need to build out an ecosystem that is more drawing on China's own internal capabilities and less subject to potential coercive forces coming from outside of China's borders, right? And this is a big contrast to the prior 2013 third plenum document that only had one article on innovation, right? So innovation has become a much higher priority, but it's also become a priority that's subsumed under this idea of national security and the need to coordinate not just economic growth and development, but security and self-sufficiency. This is not to say that China has turned away from the global trading system, but rather it's this attempt to constantly tinker with its economic system and to calibrate and to recalibrate trading relations in a more unpredictable world, right? So we see China continue to try to emphasize the need for continued global economic engagement. In particular, it's continuing to try to attract foreign investment onto its shores. It's continuing to emphasize trade relations, but trade diversification. And I'll show you some charts related to this in just a bit, right? So it joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It's continuing to sign bilateral free trade agreements with a number of countries across the world. It's applied to join the CPTPP and so on. And it's also trying to rejigger its institutions to reduce the friction at the border when it comes to trade. So there's a lot of tinkering around the edges to continue to ensure smooth trading flows between China and the rest of the world, at the same time as it's trying to figure out how to securitize itself in a de facto globalized world. It's really difficult to do so. So this is the action-reaction cycle. what is the impact on third countries, right? What is the impact in particular on developing countries? Here, I'm going to pick up on a point that Lizzie made earlier, which is that the tariffs have led to a fair amount of trade diversion and an increase in logistics in some of these third countries, like Mexico and Canada. So this figure here, put together by my colleagues at the Peterson Institute, Yeling Tan and Mary Lovely, shows us China's exports to the rest of the world divided by income groups, right? And that orange line that you see that's diverging from the trend for the other income groups is exports to high-income countries, right? And this is a direct result of the tariffs placed by the US on Chinese imports, right? So Chinese trade is increasing with the rest of the world, and so there's this divergent trend. I want to unpack this divergent trend a little bit more by looking at some of these third countries, right? So if goods aren't flowing directly from China to the United States anymore, where are they flowing? How are they getting to the United States? Right, here we have to be, pay special attention to what some economists call connector countries, right? So not just Mexico, but also Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Hungary, Egypt are some of the countries flagged by these by these two articles in the Financial Times. On the left-hand side here, you see a rise in Chinese investment into some of these connector countries. On the right-hand side, an increase in exports. So both trade and investment into these connector countries is increasing, right? And how does that fit into the trade war, into the tariffs, right? So taking Vietnam as an example, right? With the tariffs between China and the US, Vietnam starts importing more from China, and then the US starts importing more from Vietnam, right? So it's the same goods, they're just going through a more circuitous route. So on the left-hand side, in this figure here, right, this is US imports from Vietnam in blue, and Vietnamese imports from China in red. And then you start to see, right, the blue bar rising above the orange bar over time. On the right-hand side is an econometric analysis by some economists. Caroline Freund leads this study. And it shows that the trend is not restricted to Vietnam, right? Countries that are importing more from China are also exporting more to the United States. And this is particularly so when it comes to a subset of more important goods. So within this tariff war and tariff tensions, it seems like there is a small group of winners, right? If we think about developing economies, right? These connector countries seem to be doing great, right? They're getting investment from China, they're getting trade from China, and they're exporting more to the US market. So it would seem like there is this unintended consequence, greater inefficiency in supply chains, more indirect relations with China, between the US and China, rather than a straight up decoupling. But are these developing countries happy about being in that connector status? Right, I want to spend the next few slides talking about how these economic gains in trade and investment are not enough to compensate for larger concerns by developing countries when we look at US-China tensions. Why are they not enough to compensate? The first thing is the rise of industrial policy in both countries, both the US and China, which Lizzie also touched on, right? And this industrial policy competition is squeezing out space for smaller economies, for developing countries to figure out a pathway to growth and a pathway to being competitive, because there is no way they can compete in a subsidy war between these ginormous, between these giant economies, right? This figure on the left here just shows you in terms of Chinese industrial policy spending, right? And it's a chart by CSIS, right? It far outstrips industrial policy spending by other economies, and on the right-hand side, you see it's growing over time as well. So it's really hard to compete against this type of this approach to boosting manufacturing. Alongside that, you have the US also starting to double down on the industrial policy, right, in its own ways, right? So we have the IRA, right, which pumps a whole lot of money into green energy production into clean technology manufacturing. You have the CHIPS Act, right, that's trying to reshore or onshore manufacturing in semiconductors, right? And this is having its own set of reverberations on other economies. Alongside the US and China, we have other economies. The European Union has announced its Green Deal industrial plan. Australia has a reconstruction fund. Japan has an act for green transformation, right? So countries are, in a sense, channeling a lot of their fiscal power towards trying to compete in this green energy space, right? To get up to speed with what Lizzie described in China as this fundamental restructuring in the sources of growth. Where is the space left for developing countries, right? So there is some sense in which they might be able to benefit, which is that on the consumption end, right? Again, if we want to just reduce people to their roles as consumers, right? The flow of fiscal subsidies and tax incentives and so on into the green energy space is likely to push down, right, in standard economics, the price for a lot of these new energy products, from solar panels to EVs and so on. That is not a bad thing for the green transition, right? And if developing countries can afford and have access to cheaper electric vehicles, cheaper solar panels and so on, they can benefit from this, but they benefit as consumers, right? So where is the pathway for developing countries to chart a growth strategy in green industry, right? That question, I think, is left hanging because they simply cannot compete with Australia, Japan, Korea, the EU, the United States, and China all pumping either direct subsidies or indirect subsidies into this space. So this is a real concern, right? And I think it overshadows and outweighs some of the immediate gains that we see the connector countries receiving in the tariff diversion, right? There's a bigger picture out there, which is industrial policy competition and geopolitical uncertainty. And this geopolitical uncertainty is creating a real sense of ambivalence amongst developing countries. Here I want to focus on Southeast Asia, right? I am from Singapore, so this is the dynamics happening in Southeast Asia is of particular interest to me. I'm going to show you some figures that come from a report from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. So they do an annual survey of elites across Southeast Asian countries, and they ask them a bunch of questions. Some of the questions are repeated over time, so you can see trends over time. This figure here asks the Southeast Asian elites whether they are worried or welcoming to the regional economic influence of China, the US, and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So set aside ASEAN, right? Set aside the blue bubbles. Focus on the red and green bubbles, right? So red refers to China, and then green, the United States. On the left-hand side are the share of Southeast Asian elites who report that they are worried about either China or the US's growing economic influence. On the right-hand side, right, whether they are those that welcome the regional economic influence of the US in green, and then China in red. The shaded differences compares the survey results from 2023 and 2024. What's interesting is that when it comes to welcoming the regional economic influence of the US and China, compared to 2023, elites in Southeast Asia are downgrading their level of comfort with both economies, with both countries. And the shares are different, but they're increasingly worried about both China and the United States, right? So it's not a zero-sum game where, you know, a fall in popularity for China means a rise in popularity for the US, right? Rather, that geo-economic rivalry is creating concerns by Southeast Asian countries towards both. If you unpack this a little bit more, right, here I'm focusing on those connector countries that I showed you in the Financial Times figures, right? So Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. So amongst these connector countries, you would expect them, right, they're benefiting from the trade war. They're getting more investment from China, more trade from China, and exporting more to the US. Are they welcoming? They're not, right? If you look at Vietnam in particular, right, close to 88% of elites surveyed in Vietnam are worried about China's growing economic influence. Right, if you look at Thailand, right, 80% are worried about China's growing economic influence, and this is very close to their level of concern with the United States as well. 78% are worried about the US's economic influence. So there's this strange situation where connector countries are not celebrating their economic gains, right? They're much more worried about the bigger picture. And when surveyed about what they think Southeast Asia should do, the results are very interesting as well. What's common on the right-hand side here is when asked about whether or not they support this option, which is to choose either the US or China in this geopolitical rivalry, very few elites across Southeast Asia think this is a good idea, right? There's no desire to try and choose sides in the geopolitical competition. Rather, if you look at the right-hand side, right, the overwhelming path forward chosen by Southeast Asian elites is to try to enhance the resilience and unity within Southeast Asia itself to fend off pressure, right, to create more strategic autonomy and space in a situation where that strategic autonomy and that space is shrinking, right, and to try to find ways to remain unified and not let the geopolitical tensions tear the region apart. So that's the overwhelming concern here, right? To look for sources of multilateral cooperation outside of the US-China rivalry. So to conclude quickly, right, I started by talking about this action-reaction spiral between the US and China and how that's generating an economic security dilemma, right? There are some winners in this competition, these connector countries, right? But their economic gains are outweighed by a lot of the geopolitical uncertainty and industrial policy competition. It leaves very little room if you're a smaller economy trying to figure out how to maintain your economic resilience and your economic growth strategy, right? You get the sense that the air is just being sucked out of the room for many of these countries. And third countries have no desire to be picking sides. What they want is autonomy and space for themselves to figure out how they can flourish. And they're looking to each other, right? If the US and China are fighting with each other, then let's look outside the US and China, right? Let's look to each other for cohesion, let's look to each other for resilience, for sources of stability in an otherwise increasingly unpredictable world. So I leave you with those thoughts, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you very much.
I might reposition the microphone.
Okay, just on Yeling's last point, it would be interesting to know about the participation of Southeast Asian countries in the BRICS summit that has been going on almost as we speak in Kazan, Russia. Some 30 plus states were sent representatives to that summit. So the number of states participating went way beyond the membership of the BRICS. Yeling emphasized that third countries, so the general category of third countries, are not keen to get involved in these kind of competitions. And yet, just on the face of it, the fact that 30 states, or more than 30 states, were represented at the BRICS summit suggests that quite a number of states are not hesitant to at least indicate that they are sympathetic to the BRICS type agenda of finding or ways to begin to construct an alternative world order which is not focused on the United States. So my particular question would be, since you emphasize Southeast Asia wanting to promote its autonomy from these geopolitical, global geopolitical events, my question would be, how many Southeast Asian states were represented at the BRICS summit? And I just leave that as a question. But the title of today's session is What's at Stake in the US-China Trade War? And you can answer that question with one word. The word is hegemony. Hegemony is at stake. I refer you to a document, a very short, just two-page document, published by the US Congressional Research Service in 2022. And this document set out the basic principles of US foreign policy, economic and military policy. And it says, really, I'm naive, so I was kind of surprised, but it says in black and white that the primary aim of US foreign policy is to assert hegemony over Eurasia. Now, it doesn't actually say what it means by Eurasia, but so we're certainly talking Russia and China. And of course, one understands, I mean, the US actions are very consistent with that in terms of, just as an example, 750 plus overseas military bases. Very many of the US military bases are in this area, Eurasia, however you define it. And so, as part of this, we have this extraordinary fact that the initiative, the leading agency in the formation of U.S. industrial policy, which is very much a policy aimed at China, at the competition with China, the lead agency in industrial policy was not the Treasury, was not the Commerce Department, was not the other economic parts of the US government. It was the National Security Agency. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, was the one who gave the big speech outlining the principles of US industrial policy, the principles of the CHIPS Act, the principles of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Who came up with that title, the Inflation Reduction Act, to cover the content of the act? I really don't know, because it's got very little to do with inflation. But of course, everybody wants to reduce inflation, so just to call it Inflation Reduction Act means that automatically heads are nodding, yes, 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 we must reduce inflation. But the content of the act is about industrial policy. It's about giving enormous subsidies to US producers of high-tech products to set up production in the United States, and also to put export controls on high-tech exports from the United States to China, but not actually just export controls from the United States to China, but also export controls from US allies to China as well, such as, for example, all the pressure that's being put on ASML, the Dutch company which has the world monopoly in making the equipment needed to make the most advanced chips. So it's very, very strange, the situation that we're in, where one Dutch company has a monopoly on making these extremely sophisticated, extremely expensive machines to make the most advanced chips in the world. And then this company hires two jumbo jets to put one machine, to get one machine into Taiwan, TSML, the leading company, the monopoly company in the world in making the most advanced chips. So, and the cost of each machine is between $300 and $400 million. So anyway, the point is that all this is being done by the United States in order to try and contain China, to slow down its rise. And that this is being done by being led rather by the national security establishment. So I think it's worth just putting this in a much bigger historical context. Go back to the first Cold War. In the first Cold War, there was very little economic exchange between the Soviet Union and the West and the United States in particular. So you had geopolitics over here, you had the geopolitical experts over here working on this stuff vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and over here you had the economy of the world and the economists working on that, but these two realms were quite separate. And now what has happened is that geopolitics is in bed with the economy. Geopolitics is in many ways driving economic policy, as in, for example, all the ideas about free trade, globalization as being good. All these are being qualified now by the fact that in the driving seat of national economies, especially the US economy, you have geopolitical experts who are making very different kinds of calculations than standard economists would. And then, as Yeling said, you have much the same going on in China as a reaction to all this. Namely, as you said, in the 14th five-year plan, this word security was used many more times than it had been used in previous such documents. Security has been elevated right up to almost the top priority. But I want to draw attention to the fact that there is a real puzzle here. And let me go back to something that Simon Kuznets said in the 1970s. Simon Kuznets, the great Russian-American economist, said there are three types of countries. 1, developed countries. 2, developing countries. 3, Japan. Well, nowadays you would have to update that by saying there are 3 categories of countries. 1, developed countries. 2, developing countries. 3, China. And in particular, China shows something that has never before happened in world history, namely that on the one hand, it remains a very poor country. I mean, just in terms of its average income relative to that of the US, if you use market exchange rates, its average income relative to that of the US is about 17% or less than 20%. If you use purchasing power parity exchange rate, it's more like 27%. But it's still way down. It's number 65 or number 70 in terms of the ranking of countries. The US is round about number 6 in terms of average income. So that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, China is certainly a leading, if not the second most leading technologically advanced country in the world. A recent study identified 44 high-tech sectors in the world and concluded that China was leading in 35 of the 44 sectors. Just what leading constitutes, I don't remember offhand, but anyway, that was the headline, that China was leading in somewhere around about 3/4 of the high-tech sectors in the world at the same time as it remains a very poor country on average. And so that's how you understand a lot of China's international relations. China operates in international fora with two hats. One, we are a very poor developing country, and therefore we are entitled to all kinds of trade preferences that are accommodated for poor countries, a poor developing country. And on the other hand, we are a superpower, and we want to sit at the table. Ideally, we don't want to have a G20 or a G7. We want a G2. A G2 meaning the US and China sit around the table and they make these arrangements, so to speak. That's the long-term strategy, or at least one might infer that. So let me just say something about the U.S. Policy on this war, Cold War with China. As you know, the U.S. is using not just subsidies, production subsidies, to get advanced production in the United States, and secondly, export controls against China, but it's using tariffs. And on the face of it, that is puzzling, and I think Yeling suggested this. It's puzzling in the sense that US manufacturing accounts for a very small share of total US employment. The US economy is overwhelmingly now a service economy, and the service economy is not likely, at least on the face of it, to be boosted by these enormous tariffs that Trump and Biden have been placing on imports from China. So that's the first point about the use of tariffs as a key instrument in this Cold War. But the other point that is not getting any attention, and I do find it surprising that it is being so overlooked, is that is to do with the exchange rate, the US exchange rate. And the point here is that the US dollar is being pumped up by enormous capital inflows from the rest of the world. So people want to get out of national currencies and buy US dollars, and their purchases of US dollars pumps up the US exchange rate, and that high US dollar makes it very difficult for US manufacturing to compete. Well, the question is, what might be done to manage the US exchange, or can anything be done to manage the US exchange rate down? Well, there's one obvious way to do it, and that is to put a tax on capital inflows. For example, I mean, just this is one way it might be instituted. It could be made a requirement that short-term capital coming into the US, like hot money, to get advantage of a stock market boom, coming into the US could be required, or in fact all money coming into the US could be required to go into a US bank where it would have to stay for, let's say, 3 months or 6 months, whatever the period is, with no interest. Well, that would be a very strong discouragement for hot money to come into the US, but it would not be a strong discouragement for long-term investments in the US financed by foreign capital. You know, to make a chip factory, for example, that would not be held back by such a mechanism. So that would be one obvious way to kind of help to manage the dollar down. But you only have to say that to imagine the reaction from Wall Street. Wall Street would go ballistic at any government that proposed to put a tax on capital inflows, because this is so much part of the profits of Wall Street. Let me say something just finally about the China side of all this. It is dramatic that as China is cutting back on this huge flow of investments under the Belt Road Initiative to all around the developing world, nevertheless, right now, it continues to make big investments in the project of making China into a transport hub of Asia. And so it is investing in railways, 3 railways from China to Vietnam, a railway from China to Laos, a railway out to the east to Uzbekistan to get goods into Europe. And this is all, those are just examples of a much wider strategy that China is implementing to make itself into the center of gravity of Asia. And it is striking that China is doing this even as China has a massive debt problem. Just today, there was a letter in the Financial Times which spelt this out. So, by IMF statistics, China's debt, that is federal, central government and local government debt, is about 90% of GDP, 90%. Whereas, for example, Germany's is 60%, South Korea's is 57%, Australia's is 50%. Can't think what Britain's is at the moment. But in any case, does anybody know? Okay. China's is about 90%. But that's one way of measuring debt. But as this letter points out, you have to also put in the debt on the books of special financial vehicles, I think that's the term, which are used by local governments in China to finance infrastructure investments. And the point is that the debt of these special financial instruments is kept off the books of the local government. So when local government's debt is calculated, this other debt is not included in that. So that's the third kind of debt, central debt, local government debt. Third kind of debt is that one that I just mentioned, but also fourthly, the debt of state-owned companies. And when you add this debt together, it comes to something like 250% of GDP. So China has an enormous debt problem, and so it's having to navigate through this pressure, on the one hand, to make itself the center of gravity of Asia, the center of gravity of the transport networks, for example, and the ports, and on the other hand, not to tip into a massive debt crisis. So I will end there just with one additional point, and that is the way that China has been trying to overcome these tariff constraints that are placed on its exports to the United States. So this is what is happening. A container ship is coming from China, is unloading at the port of Los Angeles, and its contents are put onto bonded trucks, which then take all the goods in these bonded trucks down to Tijuana, that is in Mexico, on the Mexican side of the border with San Diego. Companies like Amazon and a whole lot of other companies have established enormous warehouses in Tijuana where the goods in the bonded trucks are disassembled and put into packages which are worth $800 each or less. And then once they're put into these small packages worth $800 or less, the goods are put back onto trucks and taken across the border into the United States, into factories where the goods are reassembled into their original form. Why this bizarre practice, very expensive practice, you would think? And the reason is because there is in US customs law what is called the de minimis clause, and that says that goods which come into the United States worth $800 or less will not pay a tariff. And so this is a way of escaping the Chinese imports, some of the Chinese imports to the US, escaping the tariff. But this is the kind of thing, like from who knows, a really bizarre novel. This is the kind of thing that's going on as a little example of how people are responding to this trade war between China and the US. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think I'm going to open it up to questions, and if you guys have thoughts about Robert's comments, then maybe you can add those into the things. But I want to give students a chance to ask questions. So let's have a look. So let's start with at the front here, and any questions upstairs, and the gentleman in the waistcoat.
Thank you for an informative talk. My question is long, so I wrote it down. So in terms of green industrial policy and the inability to compete, I'm not sure about China's endowment in renewable energy sources, but knowing that Africa, for example, is very rich in those sources, but obviously very technologically poor and unable to compete. My question is, will China offshore clean energy production, and is there any way for the developing countries to have a green industrial policy that doesn't trap them in the same primary resource extraction trap that they've been trapped in?
If you could pass the microphone to the gentleman behind you.
So for me, it's very fascinating. You touched upon the connected countries. I want to know more, about your opinion, your recommendation, how the connected countries exploit, the competition, the fierce competition between these two superpowers to their advantage.
Okay, and the question upstairs.
Just a quick question on recent news. So I wanted to ask, how effective do you think China's recent fiscal stimulus measures will be in kickstarting economic growth, and what the main challenges of this will be?
Did everybody hear that?
No, I didn't hear that. Sorry.
Could
Can
you
say
put the
it louder
microphone
and
more
slower?
like perpendicular? Yeah.
Is that better? Yeah, so I wanted to ask, how effective do you think China's recent fiscal stimulus measures will be in kickstarting economic growth, and what the main challenges of this will be?
Okay, so we'll start with those three questions. And should I start with Yeling, and then Lizzie, or Elizabeth, and then Robert?
Sure. So thank you for your questions. Maybe I'll take them in reverse order. So on the question of the fiscal stimulus, so for everyone in the room, China's economy has obviously been struggling and in the doldrums for some time now, leading analysts to wonder why isn't the government doing more. And recently there was a Politburo meeting after which a whole series of measures were announced, first by the People's Bank of China, the central bank, that sparked a rally in the stock market, and then there was a follow-on question of, okay, there's monetary policy, but the monetary policy measures might be insufficient because credit demand in China is so weak right now, it might not actually have a stimulatory effect. Where's the fiscal policy side coming from? And then there was a series of briefings by various agencies, the Ministry of Finance, the National Reform and Development Commission. The actual figure, as far as I understand, is still a bit soft and unknown, partly because legally you need a parliamentary session to pass the spending, right? And that session has not been held yet, and I think it will only be held in early November. So there's still a big question mark over how large the stimulus will be. And officials have been quite reluctant to put solid figures to it. So people are still, I think, waiting, and there's been a series of weeks where there's just waiting and waiting and waiting, which has had sort of a dampening effect on the initial announcement by the People's Bank and coming up from the Politburo. There are some questions that are unanswered in this attempt to stimulate the economy, right? One question is this a real stimulus, or is this more of an effort to stabilize the economy, given that so many local governments are in real debt trouble, such that they are having trouble funding their existing policy mandates, right? So they are either cutting civil service salaries, or they are looking for random sources of additional revenue, such as fining cars for parking violations, or calling in business people and saying, you forgot to pay your taxes 2 years ago, could you please pay your taxes, right? There's sort of a bubbling sense of instability. So is the stimulus really just trying to put a floor under that, or is it an actual plan to kickstart growth, right? Which is an entirely different question. I mean, it's more of a growth question. What's the growth model, right? And is the growth model just, as we've seen from the third plenum, is it simply about high-tech manufacturing and indigenous innovation? If that's the only growth model, that leaves many regions in China left out, because not every region in China can compete on that model, because China is bifurcated. There are many parts of China that are struggling with traditional problems of poverty. What's the growth model for these regions, right? So I think there are larger questions that the stimulus or promise of stimulus have not answered. Should I stop there?
You add what you like.
Okay, yeah. In terms of connected countries and how they exploit competition, I mean, I think there's certainly a desire to play both sides, right? And savvy countries are trying to do that, right? To this question of participation in the BRICS summit, right? I think many countries are trying to look for insurance, right? And to the extent that these alternative forums might in some way offer insurance, right? They might participate. It wouldn't exclude them from also participating in US led initiatives, right? So the idea is to kind of diversify as an insurance strategy. That's my sense.
Okay. Do you want to?
That's great, because I was going to chip in on the question that was asked about developing countries. Can you hear me okay? So the question that was asked about developing countries and what the sort of competition over industrial policy happening in the United States and China, what that might mean for those who may, developing nations that may be sort of seen to be reliant on resource extraction or raw materials, and what the possibilities are there. And what I think I'll do is I'll raise something that actually came up in conversation back before we started today, which is something that I look at and wasn't going to speak about today, but will, and I think might help answer your question. So I want to take us back to a moment. I'm a historian, so if you haven't picked that up, but a moment in the mid-1970s that had been developing since the early 1960s, when developing nations worked together. As I say, they'd been doing so throughout the 1960s, to propose to the United Nations a vision for overhauling international trade and the international economic system. They called this the New International Economic Order, the NIEO. It was a group of 77 developing nations. China worked a little with them. It wasn't part of the G77, but it was there. If anyone is interested in doing research on China's relationship with the G77, please come and see me. I'm in the International History Department, and I am desperate to work with someone on that topic. I don't yet have the time myself to do it. I mention it briefly in my own work, and that's about it. The key point here is that this group of G77 nations came to the United Nations and said, we have a proposal, we've been working on it for years, in which the structures of international trade necessitate fundamental overhaul. And one of the suggestions they had was that the way in which raw materials and manufactured items are valued in international trade need to be reconfigured. Why is it, if value is a construct, why is it that raw materials are valued in the international trading system as cheaper than manufactured products which rely upon these raw materials? So one of the key things they argued was not this idea of we need to industrialize too, but in fact we need to reconfigure what value even means within the international economic system. It was a really transformative moment, and the key additional point that I'll make that they raised in this vision was to have the capacity for developing nations to tax multinational corporations properly tax them,
in ways that ensured that these often resource extracting corporations would contribute properly to the nation from which they are benefiting. Now, one of the key things to keep in mind, this NIEO vision came around the same time that OPEC oil embargo occurred, in which it was seen to some degree, this OPEC oil embargo, which you may be familiar with, the very high oil prices of the 1970s, the famous visions of Americans trying to fill up their cars and it's very expensive, a consequence of this oil embargo. One of the points of this oil embargo was to say, look, we're seeing a group of nations come together and push back against the hegemony of the United States in particular, and other nations as well, and we're going to show the power that can come from there. The problem was that the OPEC oil embargo devastated many developing nations as well. So the weapon of this vision was also the undoing of many of the G77. The additional point I'll make, or the additional warning that I think comes from this history, is that American corporations and American policymakers were actually very, very frightened of this NIEO. There was, this is something I'm working on, which is why I really want someone to be working with me on the China aspect of it. But one thing I think is fascinating is the ways that corporations were terrified at what was being proposed, and they actively organised themselves. They were already starting to do so in forums such as the Business Roundtable, and they began to work together to undermine what they were now starting to see is the action of the G77. So another warning, I think, for those seeking rightly to reconfigure what we take as for granted in today's world. The warning is the pushback that will come from those with power and money, and to sort of take into consideration the ways that those people with power and money, as Robert was referencing, Wall Street, who would have no interest in reconfiguring the exchange rate, that needs to be considered in tactics, I think, as well.
Okay, I don't know, do you have anything to add, Robert, or should I go for more questions?
Well, let me just add something fairly quickly because it follows directly on. It follows on from this story that Lizzie's just been telling. So the other thing that happened in the 70s is that American banks were lending huge amounts to Latin America, and telling Latin American, US government and the banks were telling Latin America, borrow and invest, and then you will have higher economic growth, you can repay the borrowing, no problem. Well, so the Latin American governments did borrow like crazy through the 1970s. And because of the oil shock that Lizzie was just talking about and other things, US inflation began to go up very fast. And then Paul Volcker came to the chair of the US Federal Reserve, and overnight, almost at the very beginning of his tenure, he hiked up American interest rates. The Latin American countries had all borrowed at variable interest rates, so their interest rate repayments on this enormous debt suddenly went up like it mushroomed. And that then led into the great Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. And that was very, very good news. Good news from the point of view of the United States. One reason being, the Latin American in debt crisis was good news. One reason was that was the end of the whole NIEO, New International Economic Order project. That was over. And that then, of course, paved the way for the great neoliberalization or globalization project. So I taught at Princeton in the early 1990s, and down the corridor from my office was Paul Volcker. So we had lunch a number of times, and at one of these lunches I asked him, before you had this great interest rate hike in 1979, which plunged Latin America into this great crisis, and not just Latin America, other countries as well, like Russia, I think. Before you did it, did you do any calculation of the likely effects on the rest of the world? Paul Volcker was a man of few words, and he just said no. And when I had recovered my shock, I said, why not? And he said, we, that is we in the Federal Reserve, the US central bank, the most important central bank in the world, we didn't have the capacity to examine the effects on the rest of the world. Well, it wouldn't have taken any first-year economics student at LSE to identify what the general shape of the calamity that was to follow from this huge increase in interest rates. But nevertheless, he seemed happy with that answer. We didn't have the capacity, so we didn't pay any attention to it. And I mean, these events were really critical in making the foundation of the world order that is now kind of unraveling or fragmenting. I mean, just now, we've been talking about the US-China trade war, but that's just one part of this larger fragmentation that's going on. But that order was set in place round about 1980, after the Volcker interest rate shock, and many developing countries in crisis, and therefore not talking at all about a new international economic order, just each one just wanting to save themselves, understandably.
Thank you guys very much. Okay, so I'm going to go for some more questions. So the gentleman on the left here in the oatmeal jumper, and I'm going to sweep across the room. So I'll start with this gentleman here and the lady behind, and I see the other two for next.
And so, if a true Cold War happens between China and the United States, will that competition or that Cold War benefit countries like Africa and Latin America? So as these countries suffered enormously under the unipolar system that was led by the United States, do you think a new system in the Cold War, if it happens, will a new system emerge that will benefit these countries? Or yeah, that's my question.
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman upstairs?
I think part of what I was about to ask, the previous gentleman asked about Africa and them. So I would like to ask a question, which is, Robert, I've been around for a while and I've written books. The professor has probably studied China. And my question is, where are we heading? Is there, we have that professor who predicted the Ukraine and Russia, the Chicago professor who made a speech 10 years ago who said this is what's going to happen. What do you think, we considering the historical background, the last 10 years, the trade war, the rhetoric, the expansion, the technology, what do you think where we are heading, China and US? The sub-question I want to add is, and the professor mentioned it, was that China is heading to more trying to be independent technologically. And we know the technology in nowadays is interconnected globally. So that is where that will lead. Would that something that would become like China becoming independent from other world and the West becoming separate? And is that where we're heading?
Okay, so he's asking you to predict the future. Okay, and there was one question, this lady right here with her hand up.
Hi, I have a question for Elizabeth and Yeling. One for each. For Elizabeth, it's about Cold War too. So you mentioned that the Cold War ended not because the systems collapsed, but because of the global convergences accumulated and they mixed up. Could you please elaborate on that point? And if there are any relevant books or papers on it, please recommend. And for Yeling, what are the systematic and institutional achievements in Southeast Asian countries? What did they do to minimize these ambivalence in real politics? So are there any new or creative initiatives beyond ASEAN cooperations? Thank you.
Okay, so we'll stop there. I saw the other hands. Okay, so maybe this time we'll start with Elizabeth and then Yeling and then Robert.
Yeah, sure. These are great questions. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. So I'll take first the question, I'll take them in order. So the first question was about the Cold War and will it help developing nations perhaps if we do enter into a new Cold War space? The short answer is no. And I say that because if we look at the history of what the Cold War was, there's been a myth amongst certain American historians and thinkers that has been dislodged now, but that was really dominant for at least the first 20 years or so in the 80s and until more recently, that argued that the Cold War was a period of, to quote one Yale historian, the long peace. And the idea was that this was a world structure that was relatively peaceful. But if you look at the history of how the Cold War raged, it was extraordinarily violent and extraordinarily destructive, largely in what we would call the global south, or what was then politically referred to as the Third World. So the Cold War was particularly destructive for developing nations and for Third World countries. So no, it's the short answer. So a Cold War dynamic may lead to sort of proxy wars. That is certainly the history of the space. So I think Yeling's done we're not in a Cold War now. And I also want to put that point in. So Yeling was talking about nations that are able to navigate global superpower, the tensions between the US and China. That is very distinct to what might be a Cold War. So first and foremost, I would say we're not there now. The second question had to do with where are we heading, and I actually think that historians don't like to predict. Political scientists like to do it all the time. I'm not one of them, but what I do think that historians are required to do by necessity is to try as best as we can to take a step back from the space in which we are currently occupying and try as best we can to take a big picture. And what I actually think at the moment is that if in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, human beings are looking back on the period that we're living through, they're not going to be particularly concerned with great power competition. I don't think that in 50 to 100 years' time, the big question in understanding the period we are living through today is going to be about the US or China, or who had a bit more power, the rise and fall and blah, 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 great power politics. I actually think the biggest concern that historians will see in 50 to 100 years is the climate crisis and what was done or not done about it. We are living through a space and a period where that climate crisis has become a casualty of a focus on great power politics, as Robert was saying, an integration of security and economic interests and geopolitical imperatives that are blinding policymakers to the big systemic issue that we as a global community are facing. So that is what I think will be the big defining question of our time, regardless of what our policymakers, both here in the UK and abroad, want us to think. So the final question was about the Cold War ending, and if I can elaborate that, what I was referring to was specifically the ending of Cold War animosity between the United States and China. So the Cold War itself was one that was fought, as I've mentioned, both within the global south, but most predominantly between the United States and the Soviet Union, and really systemic clashes over visions of development. Do you have a capitalist model or do you have a communist one? And China was very much part of that Cold War tension. It was in fact treated worse by the United States than the Soviet Union was. So the United States put harsher trade embargoes and harsher restrictions on China than it did the Soviet Union, largely because it couldn't quite understand that communism within the Chinese context wasn't imposed from externally by the Soviet Union. So it was sort of it was a retribution for a sense of China having been lost to communism. It lasted over 20 years. It was a complete misunderstanding of what was going on. But what I was referring to was when we think about the larger story of the end of the Cold War,
It is a story of the Soviet Union's collapse, the story of this experiment and attempt within the Soviet Union to build a socialist society, and systemic collapse. A colleague of mine in the International History Department, Vlad Zubok, has just written a book about and it's called Collapse, about the end of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. It's also, I suppose, the end of this Cold War era is often symbolized with the sort of the ending of, or the bringing down of the Berlin Wall. That's another very symbolic image of this end of the Cold War. When you look at US-China dynamics, when you look at the Cold War with the United States and China, things didn't end with systemic collapse in either nation. China is still a communist nation. The United States is still the capitalist nation that in a different iteration that it was since the Second World War. What I was arguing was that that ending of that animosity, the end of that Cold War antagonism, occurred because of a convergence of interests between China and the United States, particularly over the provision of cheap labour and larger sort of ideas about manufacturing and trade. And that convergence it led to a very different kind of ending of Cold War animosities, but created, and co-constitutively, created a pathway for the kind of neoliberal, globalized world that we're living in today. So when we think about the end of the Cold War in the US-China context, it looks very different, and the product of it is the world that we have inherited today.
Okay, Yeling, do you have anything to add?
So on the question and theme of the Cold War and where we are at today, I mean, I found Lizzie's comments and Robert's comments both extremely stimulating, and it leads me to reflect on the differences in terms of US-China tensions today, right? What we see the US and China trying to do is to wield national policies in a global economy that has become deterritorialized in so many ways, right, since the end of the war. And that's why many of these controls, restrictions and so on, they seem very, they have a loud sound, but when we look at the actual impact, right, it's diluted by the nature of the global economy. Right? It adds frictions at the border. It creates these weird industries to dodge tariffs and so on. But when we look at the export controls, the same thing, right? We see export controls on advanced chips and software and so on, and that of course creates a black market for these chips. And we see, reports of these chips that have been banned by the U.S. for exporting to China, finding their way into these very large technology bazaars, right, in cities like Shenzhen and so on. So many of these national controls are leaky by nature of the global economy being what it is. And we see national governments, in a sense, trying to play catch up, because the tools that they have at their disposal are originated in many cases from the Cold War, where economies were more separated, right, between the Soviet Union and the US, and so those tools seemed more effective. They're trying to revive these tools now in an entirely different economic situation, and they're finding that these tools are very leaky, and so what they're trying, you see policymakers then trying to play whack-a-mole, right, and this is where developing countries end up potentially becoming collateral damage, right? So yes, there are these connector countries, right? But politicians have cottoned on to the fact that a lot of production is simply shifting from China to these connector countries. And so what you see the US doing in its latest round of investigations is it's threatening to impose tariffs on solar manufacturing in these third countries, right? So now these third countries are finding themselves the subject of tariffs, right? Mexico is under that same pressure. The de minimis rule is under pressure as politicians and policymakers try to plug these holes, right? But it's forever going to be a game of catch-up, and I think it's because of this disjuncture, right? Tools created during the Cold War that are no longer fit for purpose in a globalized world. So that's sort of my reflection based on the comments of Robert and Lizzie. In terms of where we're heading, I think rather than try to predict the future, I would like to reflect on, being working at a school of government, I would like to reflect a little bit on what we should be doing or what we should be urging governments to do to head off some of the most alarming potential future scenarios, right? So if the economic security dilemma continues in this action-reaction cycle, right? We see each side escalating. It does not bode well for the US or China. It does not bode well for the rest of the world. So what should governments be doing? What should policymakers be thinking about? I think there should be a lot more energy focused on putting disciplines on the idea of economic security, right? Putting disciplines on the urge of policymakers to reach into that national security toolbox to say, I'm going to restrict this, I'm going to tariff that, and without consideration of that reaction, of the escalation, right? I think there needs to be a clear-headed conversation amongst policymakers on where security ends and the economy begins, because the two have become blurred, right? We see politicians talking about economic security in ways that are just increasingly stretchy, right? And I think we need to be clear about where a real security vulnerability lies and the difference between a real security vulnerability and what is an economic cost. Things that are costly are not necessarily generating of a security vulnerability. Things that are disruptive are not necessarily equivalent to a security vulnerability. But we see these differences being conflated increasingly, and then that toolbox being applied to more and more areas of the economy, triggering reactions from China or from the US to do the same, right? We see the proliferation of the security framing across many aspects of the Chinese economy today. And so I think what's needed is a conversation amongst policymakers to say, this is not leading us anywhere good. We need to sit down and impose disciplines on when and where these measures can be applied.
Okay, I want to get more questions, because there are still a couple of questions in the audience and we don't have much time. So there was this question here, and then the question at the back, and I ask all the people asking questions in this round to be brief. And then this guy had his hand up first.
Laura, the technology part of my question is
Well, I just want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to ask a question.
We got to the future though, so.
Okay, so let's start down here.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It was amazing. My question is specifically about the American election. So right now, tariffs are a huge talking point in the American election, especially on Trump's platform, kind of with the rhetoric that they're going to put America, they're going to make America more powerful than China, or make them kind of ahead on the world stage. My question is, do you think that that's true?
Okay, and question upstairs? And deeper, the lady in the baseball cap.
Okay, knowing the fact that China still holds and buys trillions of dollars of US government securities, while US public debt is highest in the history, do you think that the fact that China is exporting to the low and middle income countries more than the developed economies and investing to the developing economies tremendously is a sign of shifting Chinese long-lasting dependence of US dollar and US demand? And secondly, Putin yesterday called for alternative international payment system to re-dollarize world economy. Do you think this puts US status as reserve currency in a risk? Thank you.
Okay, and question at the back.
Hi, okay, so my question's a little bit technical, but I'm just going to try and keep it short and then, yeah, hope that it makes sense. Basically, we've been talking about, We've been talking about the use of tariffs, and we've been talking about them based on security, like the exception, under the WTO agreement, the general exceptions versus security exceptions. But I've also noticed there's been this use of like health policy, so SPS rules, as a way to kind of dictate the terms of trade. And something that's not really being talked about is China currently with Africa, they don't have any trade agreements with any African country except for Mauritius. But what they've been doing is getting African countries to sign more and more MOUs on SPS agreements as like a way to favor themselves.
Can you just talk a bit more slowly?
Sorry.
China's doing what?
Getting them to sign MOUs, short-term MOUs where China has like the bargaining power they can pull out. And I was just wondering your thoughts on this, especially since we're talking a lot about, you know, the states using, I mean, Trump did that thing where he used security exceptions, but we're not talking about like these other non-tariff, less explicit ways that the West and now China are using to like change the kind of trade dynamic with the developing world.
Okay, thank you very much. So we only have 5 minutes left, so I ask you guys to be kind of brief with your answers, and I'm going to start. Robert, if you can be very brief.
No, I'll
Okay.
ask the other two.
So I'll start with Elizabeth.
I'll be brief. I won't, I'll touch what I'm going to be able to say something of interest, not everything. So the question about the US elections and the prevalence of tariffs and other mechanisms as well within sort of US politics. I think what's really important to underscore here is the ways that there remains a political benefit for Trump and Harris and the Biden administration that we've been living with. There remains a political benefit to speak in terms of tariffs and to speak in terms of very simplistic ideas of what trade even is. Very simplistic ideas that manufacturing, employment, and employment more broadly is going to be fixed by building a couple of factories here and there. And so what that does is it obfuscates, as I mentioned, firstly where most workers are, and they're in the service economy, they're in care economies within that. So it shifts the problem to China and not towards sort of real concerns that need to be mattered. But what I think is important is the political salience of speaking in terms of tariffs and manufacturing. The fact that we still have a politics and a political rhetoric in the United States that remains really bound by mid-20th century ideas of and ideals of who a good American is. A hard hat wearing white man working in manufacturing still somehow retains political salience, even when we know that the majority of Americans don't look like that and don't work like that. And so it's a real disconnect between politics and political power and the realities of the American economy that do, I think, necessitate change. And just to come to your question about the fact that we've been focusing on tariffs and there are so many other aspects, I'm not going to get into the details of what you've asked. I think my colleagues are going to be able to give you a better answer. But where I think it connects to what I'm saying is that the United States specifically, and I think other countries more broadly, live in a space where the conversations about trade remain very simplistic. They remain very, it's our trade, America's and China's trade is the threat, even though we know about supply chain dynamics and we know and have lived through the repercussions of that with COVID and other things. And so it really necessitates a sort of more sophisticated conversation about what trade even is, beyond things like tariffs and beyond this very sort of early 20th century, not even mid, early 20th century idea about one country's trade versus another country's trade, given we're living in a world of multinational corporations and capital that underpins, flowing capital that underpins that.
Okay, Yeling, I want you just like a minute.
That was me being really quick. Sorry.
It is hard to be quick, but it was a wonderful answer.
Sure. On tariffs, I mean, I think the economic impact on the U.S. in the long term will be negative, right? But not just because it does raise prices amidst what is already quite a painful cost of living crisis in America, but it also makes inputs for whatever American manufacturing does exist, makes all of that more more inefficient and more expensive. And so I think what's happening is that politicians are saying we are competing with China, but what's actually happening is that America is becoming less competitive because of this desire to put on this muscular stance against China in the name of competition. So there's a real disconnect there, I think, between the rhetoric and the reality. And in terms of the question of payment systems and China sort of shifting and trying to look to reduce its dependence on